I've just spent over £2,000 on my very first gaming PC, but there's a catch. I have to build the whole thing myself from scratch. This is the first time I've ever built a PC in my life, and I've never been more scared and more excited in my life. It's like Christmas Day and my first day at work all combined together. There is a caveat here. I have watched a couple of YouTube videos on what I'm supposed to do, but apart from that, I've got absolutely no experience with building a PC at all. In fact, I am so clueless about this, I actually got my followers on TikTok to help me choose the components that would go in the PC. So let's take a look at what we got.
First of all, the motherboard, we've got an Asus ROG STRIX B650E F gaming Wi-Fi ATX and AM5 motherboard, followed by the GeForce RTX 4070 Super for our GPU. For the CPU, we went with the Ryzen 9 7950X3D, and we're going to be cooling that with the Corsair iCUE H150i CPU cooler. Powering all of this, we've got the Corsair RM750E Gold Certified Fully Modular ATX power supply. Sticking with Corsair for the RAM, we've got 64GB of Vengeance DDR5 RAM. For storage, we're going to be using a 1TB Western Digital SSD and a Kingston 2TB M.2 SSD. I also got some thermal paste, which I ended up not using, but I'll tell you about that later. And for the case, we have the NZXT H6 Flow RGB. Okay, let's get started by unpacking the motherboard. I'm always amazed by how gaming companies can make the most average things look so exciting. Look at the packaging on this motherboard. So I'm trying to be as careful as possible here. I think that bag around the motherboard is like an anti-static bag. I was a little bit scared that at some point, by some kind of magic, static would flow through my motherboard, destroying all of the components. I had to keep reminding myself to be as gentle as possible here. I just dropped it down there, not really thinking, just trying to take all the cables out and get everything ready. Right, so with everything out of the bag, it's time to take the motherboard out of this special bag, anti-static bag. I was advised to take it out of the bag and put it directly on top of the box, and that would be where we would assemble the majority of the motherboard before we actually got it into the case. So that's exactly what I did. I'm trying to be super careful here because I was deathly afraid of like bending a pin or breaking something on the motherboard and having to buy a whole new one. So there you have it in all its glory. Look how beautiful it looks. I just love the look of this stuff. Step one complete. Through the power of editing, you can see everything is now wonderfully tidy. It's actually thrown on the floor just out of shot. My kitchen looked like an absolute mess at the end of this PC build, but there we have it. There's our CPU. It's our Ryzen 9 7950X3D. Something that I've committed to memory because I've literally said it 1,000 times over the past couple of months. It's right there in my memory. This was probably the bit that I was most concerned about, the CPU, because I had just heard so many horror stories about people bending pins and breaking the CPU because they weren't being careful. We'll see how we get on with this, but I was just trying to be so gentle getting this out of the box. Let's see if we can get a close-up of this CPU. There we go, beautiful camera focus there. So much money on such a small component, but such an important part of the build. So here we go. At this point, I had psyched myself up to install the CPU in this AM5 socket. I'm trying to use the least amount of strength I can to open up the clamp there on the AM5 socket on this motherboard. This is the bit that I was terrified of. So many people have told me that this could go wrong, and I just could not face spending another 500 quid to replace a CPU that had never been used because I was too rough with it. As it turned out, this was one of the most simple parts of the build. As long as you place the CPU gently on the socket, you'll literally feel it fall into place. There's really nothing else you have to do. Once you're absolutely 100% sure it's seated, i.e. it's fell into the socket itself, you can just close the clamp there, pull the lever down to where you got it from, just apply a little bit of pressure here, you don't have to do anything, put the lever into place. Sometimes the cover will pop off, I've seen in other people's videos, it didn't happen with me, so I just removed it, and there you go, the CPU is fully in place. Next up, we're going to install the RAM. It seems like the logical next step whilst the motherboard is still out of the case. We went for DDR5, 64GB of 5600 MHz RAM from Corsair. It's Corsair's Vengeance RAM, and Corsair kept coming up actually as a supplier and a manufacturer of parts of the PC, and it turns out like 3 or 4 major parts of the PC build all came from Corsair, so they're definitely a company that I want to do more work with. Installing the RAM wasn't that complicated. I had been scaremongered by a couple of people who had said to me, be careful, don't snap the RAM, be careful, don't snap the RAM. Although I didn't want to break the RAM, it was a part that I was less concerned about, mainly because the cost of it compared to things like the CPU and the GPU was a lot less, so replacing it wouldn't have been as painful. So basically I went for 2 sticks of RAM as opposed to 4. Even if I got 4, I still would have gone for 64 gigabytes. But I went for 2 sticks mainly because there was a bit of a price difference and I was trying to keep the price fairly low. This is me being confused about why only one side of the RAM socket opens, and then I realized the clip only opens on one side and then it snaps back in. But here's the thing, if you've only got 2 sticks of RAM, on the motherboard it actually shows you which ports you should be using first. You can't just slot them in anywhere. I think you can and it will still work, but you won't take advantage of essentially using the 2 sticks of RAM in conjunction with each other. I think that's right. So basically on the motherboard it will show you which ports you should use first, and I think for me it was A2 and B2 or something like that. Basically the 2 ports that I've opened. I've opened up the clip here, and unfortunately this is a section where being overly gentle is not the best thing. There is a little notch on the RAM, and you basically have to line that notch up on the RAM with the notch on the motherboard, and make sure everything is straight and vertical, and then just push it in until you hear the clip close. You can see here that this has taken me quite a long time. I was just trying to be too gentle. I think I wanted to make sure everything was perfect, but you can see eventually I just got to it and give it a good old push, and you can see the clip close. Clip, there you go, that one's in, and I think we're all good. And I get the feeling with RAM, it's one of those things that once you've done it once, maybe you would just do it a lot quicker the second time and third time or fourth time. So eventually I got both sticks of RAM in, as you can see here. It took a little bit longer than I expected it to, but I was just being so careful to make sure that I didn't break anything whatsoever. But you can see on the second one, once I get it in place, I'm a little bit quicker to use a little bit of strength to push that in and get that clip to close. Next up on the motherboard, before we even have to install it into the case, we are installing the first of 2 M.2 drives. So these are the SSDs that will store all of the files, operating system on your computer. I believe the M.2 drives are the recommended drives to use in terms of their speed and stability, so that's what I went with. In order to get this into place, you have to unscrew the cover there. For my 1TB drive, I'm using WD Green. I've also got a second drive. I found out subsequently that I really should have been using my faster drive for my operating system and my slower drive for my file storage system, but I did it the opposite way around. So my faster drive is my smaller drive and my slower drive is my bigger drive. So I've got a 1TB and a 2TB M.2 drive. This motherboard actually supports 3 M.2 drives, so if I want to expand in the future, I could do that. I'll probably just leave my OS on the system on the drive that it's on, even though it is a slower drive. So basically you can see me here unscrewing the M.2 cover. Once I've got that off, it's just a case, and this should be simple, but I did get it wrong, so I'm going to keep this in because you can see me doing this wrong here. I'm basically struggling to get the M.2 drive in, and the reason is I was trying to do it almost completely flat on the case and trying to put it into the slot. At one point I'm even trying to attach the back before I attach the front. The problem is with the M.2 drive, you actually need to plug it in almost vertically, not quite vertically, but almost vertically, and you slot it in and then you secure it down on the back side of it. And you'll see me actually get it right in a second. I stop and panic a little bit because somebody who's watching the live stream said, stop what you're doing, and I didn't know what was happening. You can see then that I'll remove it, and you'll see how it should be placed into the motherboard. It needs to be much more vertical. You'll feel it slot in, and then you can see it actually dangling there almost at a vertical way. That is the angle that you need to put it in at, essentially. And then when you bend that down, you need to secure it. On my motherboard, there were just a little twist that you could twist and it would secure the M.2 drive. But on some of the boards, it actually comes with a screw that you need to screw that down into. This is the rear side of my M.2 cover, and it's almost, this is like a thermal barrier, I think, or like a, it's almost like thermal paste for the M.2 drive. I made the mistake, and you can see here I hadn't secured my M.2 drive down because I didn't realize I thought the cover just held it down. But the problem with that is when you want to take the cover off to remove that M.2 drive, that sticky stuff there that is like a heatsink for the M.2 drive sticks to the M.2 drive and makes it a nightmare. So I didn't actually secure it down because I didn't know what I was doing. But anyway, I fixed that later on. So for you guys watching this, if anyone wants to comment, say I didn't do that bit right, I know I didn't do it right. I fixed it later on. Through the power of editing, bop, there you go. The second M.2 cover is off, and we are ready to install the second M.2 drive. For this one, I used a 2TB Kingston drive. As I said, this one is slightly faster in terms of its read and write capabilities. So I probably should have got a smaller, faster drive for the operating system, but I didn't, and we are where we are. The installation of the second M.2 drive was a lot easier just because I knew what I was doing, but it was at this point that I realized my motherboard had its own way of securing the M.2 drives because it was just clearer on this section of the case, and it's also the point that I had to go back and sort the other one out. So I'm going to cut all of that out, but essentially basically I fixed the first M.2 drive correctly and the second one was done correctly, and I covered everything back up. Next up, it's time to install the motherboard into the case. Look at that peely goodness. You guys are probably so jealous. This is what the rear of the motherboard looks like, by the way, where all the ports are. I'm not sure whether people who haven't built a PC know that the thing that you're plugging your USB ports into is in fact the motherboard. Another mistake here from me, you can see me holding the motherboard in place here. There was actually a single stand that the motherboard was kind of hanging on, but really what I should have done here is laid the case down rather than having to hold the motherboard in place and try and secure one of the corners, which you can kind of see happening in the background here. Mostly this is a close-up picture of the back of my arm, but if I'd have laid the case down, I could have put the motherboard in place and it would have been super simple. I did manage to do it this way, but it's not the most convenient way of doing it, and it's something that I only realized after the fact. Actually, somebody commented it when I was live streaming the PC build. Someone commented it, but I didn't see it until afterwards. We got the motherboard installed into the case though, and it all worked out fine. You can see me just securing the rest of the screws. Some cases you have to put the stands in for the motherboard itself. With the H6 Flow, I actually had one stand in place and I could just screw everything else in very easily. Next up, it's time to unpack the cooler. This looks great. It's from Corsair yet again, one of many parts that I ended up buying from Corsair, and this is my CPU cooler. So let's get this unboxed. I felt like I had to be less careful at this point. I felt like all of the delicate things, apart from the GPU, which comes a little bit later, were installed and ready to go. There's a lot of cables and stuff here, but thankfully this wasn't too complicated to put together. So once I got all of this out, the next step was to get the radiator, which is the bit at the top there with the fans attached. I had screwed the fans into this. It's very simple to do. You really want the fans to be sucking air out of the case and blowing them out of the top. I grabbed all of the wires and fed them through the top of the case. This is a dual chamber case, so I can basically hide a lot of those wires in the back and not really worry too much about cable management. And I just slotted this into place fairly carefully. I was still trying to be as careful as possible, but keeping those cables out of the way at the top and holding it in place. And then once you've got all of that in place, it's really just a case of getting one or two screws secured to the top of the case, and then you can go and do the rest without having to hold it in place. Just fast forwarding a little bit so you can see that there. I managed to get the cables into the rear chamber of the case, and you can see me holding the radiator in place here and just trying to get that first screw in. Important things for me here are that the radiator is installed so the tube that goes to the actual CPU cooling block is on the right hand side, and you'll see why that's important later. But basically getting that first screw in one corner and then another screw in the other corner, which means I could then let go of the radiator and just secure everything that needed to be secured. And now we come to the reason why I didn't need to use the thermal paste that I bought, because it came pre-applied to this CPU cooling block. Essentially all I did here, and the only bit that you've missed, is that I screwed the cooling block over the top of the CPU. Sometimes you have to change the fixings for this, but for me it was already installed and ready to go. Moving on to my modular power supply unboxing. Yet again, this is from Corsair, the RM750E fully modular power supply. You would think Corsair sponsored me on this video, wouldn't you? But no, actually, most of these parts were bought because they were recommended to me, or I felt like they were the best part for my PC build. This is essentially a big block with a power switch on the back and a whole bunch of different cables. You know, sometimes you have a PC, and this was confusing to me because I'd never bought, I'd only had pre-built PCs before. The little switch on the back, that is essentially switching on your power supply. I'm sure to a whole bunch of PC builders, they'll be like, oh my god, that's so obvious. But actually, for someone who's only ever used a PC that's already built for them, or it's been for work purposes, and actually I've used a MacBook for the majority of the time that I've been using computers, I had no idea that the switch on the back was going to a block that looked like that was the power supply that then fed power to all the different components on the PC. It's not that obvious, and you wouldn't know it unless you'd actually built a PC. This ended up being a little bit of a pain, to be honest with you. Understanding which cables go in which holes and why each cable does each thing is a bit of a nightmare. Some cables only fit into one space, so it's pretty obvious, but some cables could go in multiple places, but it's different. Everything is labeled, and with instructions and YouTube tutorials, it's not too bad. I'm going to skip over most of this because it's mainly me plugging cables into different sockets. There you go, we're finally getting the power supply into the case. So with the H6 Flow, there's actually a little stand here where the power supply goes. So you just pop it on there and you can screw it in from the other end. You can see a little vision into the future of what my cable management process might be like. It's not pretty, it's not nice. Moving on to this beast, the GeForce RTX 4070 Super 12GB GPU, my graphics card. I left this till last, which seems to be the recommended way to do things. You see me opening it up here and unboxing it. It all looks incredibly beautiful. What you don't know is that I idiotically got very, very stressed towards this point because you'll see in a minute that there is two cables, a split cable coming out of the GPU. The GPU actually came with its own cable, and I was really confused as to how to connect that to my power supply unit. So I didn't actually get footage of me installing the GPU. What I did get was it installed, and it does work. So I did do it correctly, and honestly it's fairly simple. Basically, there is a port on your motherboard where the GPU goes. In fact, I had two ports. Use the topmost port if you've got two. You remove some slots out the back of the case, and it basically goes into a slot and clips in, and very much like the RAM, you'll hear it snap into place, and that's basically it. So there you go, you can see it installed, boom, there it is, and those two cables are the things that brought me a whole lot of heartache. Fast forward a couple of months, and I wanted to talk to you about what it's been like using this PC that I built with my bare hands. I've used this every day since the day I built it, for everything from editing using Premiere Pro, for Photoshop work, for streaming, for gaming, and I've played almost everything on it and never even had a stutter. I'm streaming running OBS and TikTok Live Studio whilst playing a game, and the computer doesn't stutter at all. One of the big things I was surprised about was how much quicker this was at rendering video than my MacBook Pro that I was using before. Premiere Pro used to crash all the time for me when I was using my MacBook Pro, and I don't think I've had a single crash on this machine. One of the things I'm most proud about with this build is that it booted the very first time. Obviously, after you have built the PC, you have to go through the process of installing Windows, installing your drivers, and I'll put down in the description the video that I use to guide me in my PC build, because I just think it's absolutely phenomenal. I wouldn't personally use me as a guide because this is my first PC build. I would use the person that I used as a guide. And the issue that I talked about with the GPU cable, once I figured out what it was really easily solved. I was terrified at all times that I was going to plug something in wrong from the power supply and it was going to fry whatever I'd plugged in incorrectly. But it turns out there was just a different cable that I needed to use, and all of the stress was really for nothing. It didn't really help that I was live streaming the PC build at the same time, because there was lots of people kind of giving me differing advice. I tried to stick as much as possible to the YouTube video tutorial that I watched, but honestly, I'm so happy with the PC. It works incredibly. There are things that I would change if I went back and did it again. Like I said, I would use a faster drive for my operating system rather than the faster drive for my bigger SSD. Basically my fast drive is now for my gaming library and my slower drive is for my OS, which means my actual whole computer is running slightly slower in terms of read-write speed than I would like. But that's such a minor thing. A couple of tips from me: if you're going to buy Windows, go to like a CD keys type website. I went for a Windows 11 Pro and I think it cost me about 10 quid or something in the end, and everything's worked perfectly. Like I said, I use this every single day, and I cannot recommend enough building your own PC. I was the person that said they would never ever build their own PC. I didn't want to be that guy. I didn't even want to be a PC gamer. The only reason I did it is because the PC that I was using before was fairly underpowered. So running something like OBS and TikTok Studio and a game at the same time would just make it stutter, especially on bigger, more demanding games. Things like Red Dead Redemption 2 that I was playing a lot of the time used to make the PC stutter, the old PC stutter, but this one just runs so smoothly. But the act of actually building it means that now when there's a problem, I have a little bit more confidence with unplugging stuff, seeing what's going wrong. Actually, if I needed to take the PC apart and clean it and rebuild it, I could absolutely do that. The cable management at the back I'm not even going to show you because it's disgusting. I did go to fix that up the other day, and honestly, I just couldn't face it. I know I have to unplug everything and replug it back in. The case is so good though, because it's a dual chamber case, the H6 Flow. All of the cable management stuff that I haven't done is hidden away in the secondary chamber. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I really enjoyed building the PC after the fact. I think I would do it about 10 times quicker if I did it a second time. And if you are gonna get a PC, then building it yourself is a really fun project. They call it Lego for adults, and I would tend to agree with that, but there's a little bit more complexity to it, and it will give you such a better understanding of your PC and give you much more confidence in terms of like managing that on an ongoing basis, especially if you're using that for what you do for a living, as I am with content creation and streaming. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and do go and check out the other videos I've got here on YouTube, and I will see you on the next one.